Hey, what's going on guys? Today's video is going to be going over Ivara's Navigator build for hunting Eidolons. Using Ivara's Navigator in the DPS role is one of the more challenging builds, if not the most challenging build to play for Eidolon DPS. And if you're looking to play this build for the Eidolons, just know going in it's going to take a good amount of investment to make happen. And I'd say it's more for people who are bored with the current meta and are looking for different builds to play. And this Navigator build is a very good replacement for frames like Chroma or Rhino, but it does have a much higher skill cap than those two. And if you want to be doing 5 3 caps in one night cycle, it's going to take a good amount of practice to get there, because there's a lot of little optimizations you can do with the Navigator, and if you haven't had much experience with it before, it can be kind of challenging to control. And I'll be the first to admit, I'm not the best with this, but I think this video is still going to give a good idea of how to build for it properly. And before I go into the builds, I'm going to first talk about the abilities, because understanding how Navigator works is important to how you build it. So let's start with Ivara's Navigator. Navigator is an ability that allows Ivara to control a projectile from a given weapon. This can be activated in two basic ways. The first is by pressing the ability, which you'll see creates a circular effect around your reticle, and then throwing or shooting a projectile. The second is by throwing or shooting a projectile first, and then activating your Navigator. Now while you're controlling the projectile, you can either slow it down by holding the aim button, or speed it up by holding the fire button. This basically just allows you to control the projectile easier, and the slower your projectile is moving, the easier controlling it becomes. And as you'll see in the gameplay section, helps a lot with the Eidolons. Now the most important part of this ability is the damage multiplier it gives you. So you can see in the bottom right hand corner, on top of the Navigator icon, it shows what multiplier my damage is at. With this build's power strength, at max I get a 15.4 times multiplier, which is a huge multiplier. That's basically like having a 1500% Rhino buff, which is a ton of damage and why Navigators use it with Ivara to kill the Eidolons. The trick to the damage growth here is that it's based on your ability duration, and the lower your duration is, the faster you gain the multiplier. So for using Navigator, we want to have as little duration as possible. For this build, I'm using 12%. Having low duration allows you to climb your multiplier much faster than having a higher duration on Navigator. Now when you control a projectile with Navigator, you can only grab one pellet, which means that multi-shot has no effect with the Navigator. And when building your weapons, you want to ignore multi-shot, which I'll go over in the build section. And as you control the projectile with Navigator, it's going to drain energy over time, based on your ability efficiency and your ability duration. Because our duration is at 12% with this build, we're basically forced into a bad channeling cost here. Which is okay and it is manageable, but you want to keep Navigator active for as little time as possible. Because the longer you control it, the more energy it's going to drain from you. And it's going to keep increasing until you're losing tons and tons of energy every second. And as you can see, it ramps up pretty fast. This means you want to time your Navigator appropriately when fighting the Eidolons to make sure you're not wasting a lot of energy flying it around, but at the same time ensuring you get to the damage multiplier cap. And because Navigator is so energy intensive, you want to bring a whole bunch of energy pads with you, because you're going to run out of energy while playing Ivara. That's just how it is, especially with the Glaive version of this build. And I'll talk about that more during the gameplay section. But basically we're just using Navigator for its damage. And the Augment Piercing Navigator also gives you a bunch of damage. What this augment does is that every time your Navigator successfully hits something, you're going to get 10% increased base crit chance. This will stack up to 50% total, and is applied to your weapon before mods, which is even better than Hero's crit chance, which is after mods. This means you can take a fairly low crit chance weapon like the Glaive Prime, and give it almost 100% crit chance. This supposedly scales with ability strength, although I had a hard time testing it. But basically all you need to know is that it's going to give you extra crit chance. The next ability I'll quickly cover, which is Quiver. If you're using Quiver, you want to be using the Augmenting Powered Quiver, which has two effects. The first is that you can throw down a cloak arrow that will allow you to ignore all status procs. You're probably not going to be using your cloak arrow during the Eidolon hunt. The second uses for your dash wire, which while you're standing on your dash wire will give you an increased crit damage. And this can be a huge increase to you if you're going to be using the Castanas version of this build, which I'll talk about in a bit. You can also use Ivara's third ability, Prowl, to increase your headshot damage, which is really only useful for killing the Eidolon at the end, but it does also give you a significant increase in damage, so it's worth doing if you need the extra damage. And finally, Ivara's passive gives you innate enemy radar. This will give you 20 meters of enemy radar and is useful for finding bombalists. But that's really going to do it for Ivara's abilities. If you want to know more about Ivara's Artemis bow, I went over that in my last video, so I'd suggest checking that out if you're interested. But now that I've talked about how the abilities work, let's look at my builds. This first build is the Glaive version of the Navigator build. The main differences for the Glaive version are that I'm running Steel Charge for increased melee damage, and I'm also running Piercing Navigator, which synergizes very well with the Glaive. Also you'll see I'm running Arcane Fury here. Fury is very easy to proc with your Glaive, and you should have about 100% uptime with it, making it a great arcane for increasing your glaive damage. And as for the Arcane Guardian, I'm just using it for survivability because Ivara is very squishy. And having 600 armor from Guardian is very helpful. And you'll notice I'm not running nullifiers here. With this build, you really need a hero in your group to both protect you from the damage that the energy spike causes, as well as ignore the magnetic procs. And I'll talk about that more during the gameplay section. But if you're playing this build, there's no real good way to use it outside of organized runs. As for the rest of the build, the most important stats here are the 12% duration, because remember, the lower your duration is, the faster your damage multiplier is going to scale. And then I have high strength with reasonable efficiency. You don't want your efficiency to be too negative because you're already using a lot of energy while channeling your Navigator. And efficiency will affect things like the casting cost. And speaking of the efficiency, running Fleeting Expertise for efficiency here is very important because it's going to reduce your duration. It's by using Fleeting Expertise with Transient Fortitude that we're able to get that 12% duration. Unfortunately, because our duration is so low here, having more efficiency isn't really going to be helpful because it won't reduce the channeling cost further. The 12% duration kind of screws us into having a high channeling cost. But for the rest of my strength, I'm running Blind Rage, Augur Secrets, and Intensify, with Vitality for survivability. As for flow here, I played the build with and without it, and I really like having flow because it gives you a nice cushion of energy if you end up channeling your Navigator for too long. And then because this is the Glaive version of the build, Piercing Navigator gives you a lot of increased damage, because as I mentioned, it gives you base crit chance, and the Glaive itself doesn't really have the high crit chance in the first place. So by using the Piercing Navigator, it'll guarantee we get crits. Now because this is the Glaive version, let's take a look at how I built my Glaive Prime. This Glaive Prime build is basically the only reason in the game to use both sacrificial mods. And that's because you get 40% increased damage to sentience per mod, for a total of 80% increased damage to sentience, which are the Eidolons, if you didn't know. And this extra 80% will multiply your total damage. So instead of just adding 80% increased damage, it's going to take whatever damage you're doing with your Glaive, and then it's going to multiply it by 1.8 times. So the way I built my Glaive is for damage, radiation damage, and crit. So here I get damage from Sacrificial Pressure, as well as Spoiled Strike. I get my radiation damage from Voltaic Strike, Molten Impact, and Shocking Touch. And then as for crit, I have Sacrificial Steel, like I mentioned earlier, Organ Shatter, and Gladiator Might. You'll notice I'm not using attack speed mods here, and that's just because I'm building it for damage. The attack speed bonus on the Glaive really isn't going to be too noticeable, but I guess like if you have enough damage and you want to build for attack speed, you can. And speaking of damage, this build does not need any Rivens. Obviously it's pretty expensive with both the sacrificial mods, and I haven't tested it without them fully leveled. But if you're going to be playing this build, I'd really suggest investing into these mods, simply because they're going to increase your damage so much. Again, the Ivara Navigator builds aren't really something you can just throw together on a whim. It's going to take some time and investment to pull off. Now the other thing I want to mention about the Glaive is that we're going to be using the Charged Throw attack, which requires you to be dual wielding it with a secondary to pull off. The way this works is when you hold down your melee and the reticle turns blue, it'll then become a Charged Throw projectile. If you hold down your melee for too long, it'll throw the projectile without it being charged, and the easiest way to tell is that when it's charged, it'll have a orange and purple glow around it, and when it's not charged, it won't. The Charged Throw version of this build has two main effects. The first is that it has infinite punch through, so you can shoot through the Eidolon as many times as you want, so long as you have energy. This allows you to easily proc Piercing Navigator and gives you a lot of crit. The second thing is that it does the most damage, meaning that you're going to be maximizing your damage while having a charge throw out. And trust me, I did a run making the mistake of not charging it properly, and it was awful. So just make sure your projectile's charged. And if it's not, just rethrow your Glaive, because you don't want to be using a non-charged projectile. As for the rest of the build, you can really use whatever you want. Here I have a Lanka just to help me with damage if I miss my Navigator. And you can also navigate the Lanka, but it's not really that great because the projectile's too fast. The other thing I have here is the Icarus Prime, but you could really use any secondary that allows you to dual wield with your Glaive. And if you're curious about my Artemis bow build, here it is. The Artemis bow is okay here, but you're really only going to use it if you mess up your Glaive throw. But now that I've talked about the build, let's look at some Glaive gameplay. Navigator Ivara fills the same role that other DPS Warframes do, which means that you're going to be picking up that first lure, charging it, and getting to the Terror List to then pop the first limb. And because you're playing a DPS role, you're going to be using the Unaru Focus Tree with Unaru Wisp. But playing with Navigator is a little different than using something like a sniper rifle, and that's because you're typically going to be navigating it during the energy spike phase. This means that it's very important that you're A, immune to the energy spike damage, and B, you're immune to the magnetic procs, to make sure you don't lose your energy, which means that you basically need a hero in your group to prevent these from happening. And of course the extra crit chance that the hero gives you is going to be very nice for increasing your overall damage, but hopefully you guys should already know all of that. The way I found to use Glaive effectively is to first place down Wisps for your Madurai players, and then throw your Glaive with Navigator while the energy spike is still happening. There are two benefits to doing this. The first is that you have time to ramp up your damage appropriately, and the second is that you can proc Piercing Navigator on the Eidolon if you need to. The extra crit chance it gives you is just more guaranteed damage, and you definitely don't need a full 5 stacks, but getting 1 or 2 Piercing Navigator stacks here is very helpful. And because the charged Glaive has infinite punch through, you can basically keep it traveling inside the Eidolon indefinitely, so long as you have energy. But remember, it costs a lot of energy to maintain Navigator, which means you want to be timing it as best you can to minimize its duration. And while holding it inside the Eidolon is a very effective strategy, it can be a little hard to find the right hitbox with it. So with my limited experience with this build, I found it very helpful to move away from the Eidolon, and then aim it towards the limb's hitbox and speed it up with the fire button. But like I said, I'm not super experienced with this, and I don't have a great technique yet. So just make sure that you get some good practice in while you're playing Navigator. There are a couple hindrances to playing with Glaive Navigator. Other than Ivara's innate lack of survivability, if you miss your Navigator or you run out of energy, it can cost you a lot of valuable time during an Eidolon hunt, especially when you're trying to get multiple runs in, so just be aware of that going in, and the more you play Navigator Ivara, the less likely you are to die or mess up your Navigator. Also, if the Gantelist manages to get his dome out, it's going to prevent you from bringing the Glaive back inside the shield. Volt shields work the same way as this, so while there's a Volt shield out, you're not going to be able to pass your Glaive through the Volt shield, which can make positioning a little tricky for the knees. But as far as the Gantelist's dome goes, the Glaive can still transition from inside to outside, but not back from outside to inside. This is something you want to watch out for when fighting the Gantelist, and can be a real problem for Navigator. But overall, the Glaive is a very strong option for Navigator, and I'd really recommend trying it if you're interested. The Castanas Navigator build is very similar to the Glaive, and I'm just going to be talking about the differences I have here. So for this, I'm just running enemy radar, and because it's the correct polarity for me, I can also run an Exilus mod here, which I'm just running Power Drift for the extra power strength. The other thing I have here is Empowered Quiver, which really helps with the dash wire, because standing on top of the dash wire when you detonate your Castanas will increase your crit damage, which can be important, especially if you don't have a great Riven. And you'll notice I swapped out my Arcane Fury for Arcane Precision. It's very easy to proc the headshots with your primary weapon, and then detonate the Castanas separately. But if you don't need the extra damage from Precision, you could swap this out for another Survivability Arcane, even another Arcane Guardian if you wanted to. The build for the Castanas themselves is very simple. You just want damage, crit, and radiation. Remember, we don't need any multi-shot here because the Navigator will only take one projectile anyways, so throwing multiple projectiles is pointless. And then if you're looking for a Riven for your Castanas, you're going to want something like crit, crit damage, or plain damage. My Riven's not amazing, but it is good enough for me to one-shot the Eidolons. As for the other changes to this build, I'm running a Mutalist Quanta, which if you shoot through the alt fire for this, it'll increase your crit damage, as well as give whatever you shoot through it electricity damage, meaning that using a Quanta can be a great way to increase your damage. Although when using with Navigator it can be a little awkward, because if you press Navigator before throwing your Castana, it'll select the alt fire for the Mutalist Quanta instead, which can be a little awkward and it's not something I really enjoy using. The other thing I'm using here is the Skoliak. You can use really any weapon. I use this to kill Vombolists, and that's it. And then as for my companion here, I'm using Wyrm Prime with the Negate mod, which can help you both prevent any magnetic procs in case your hero misses his timing, or knockdowns, and that'll be available once every 5 seconds. But you could also swap this out for something like an Adarza Kavat that I've showed off in my other videos. But now that we've taken a look at the build, let's look at some Castanas gameplay. Playing the Castana build is very similar to the Glaive build, although with the Castanas, you can first place them while the Eidolon's shield is still up, and then detonate them remotely as soon as your Madurai players destroy the shield. It's during this time you can step on a dash wire for the increased damage if you have the augment. But if you have a good enough Riven, or you procced Arcane Precision, you probably won't need to use a dash wire augment. And using the dash wire like this can be a little awkward, so it's up to you if you feel like you need the extra damage. The other thing I'll say about the Castanas, and it's probably something you've already noticed, is that they stop traveling far out from the Eidolon itself. You can't just bring them all the way up into the Eidolon and park them on the limbs. You gotta kinda guesstimate where it's gonna land, and this is a lot easier when the Eidolon isn't moving, which is another reason why you want to do it during the energy spike phase. You're gonna notice the hitbox problem the most when the Eidolon's first traveling from the sea to land. During this time you can't land your Castanas on the Eidolon, which is a weakness unique to the Castanas build. It's got something to do with the Eidolon's hitbox already being at the land as soon as it starts to spawn. But because of this, you want to be using your Ivara's Artemis bow, or a primary weapon like a sniper rifle, to take down the first limb and teleport the Eidolon to the shore. But for the rest of the limbs, you can typically see your Castanas when they land on the Eidolon. Although depending on the positioning, it can be a little difficult, especially if the Eidolon's moving around. But unlike the Glaive, this gives you more time to put down wisps for your teammates. Because with the Glaive build, you're going to be channeling the whole time until it breaks. but with this you can simply place them and then continue to put down wisps to your teammates if they need them. You can also place multiple Castanas on a limb if you don't think one's going to cut it, but typically this is only really useful when taking down the Eidolon itself at the end. For the limbs themselves, you should be aiming to only use one Castana per limb, and since the Castanas don't have a big magazine size, you probably want to be conserving your ammo as best you can, although things like ammo restore pads will alleviate this a little bit. I would say of the two of these builds, I enjoyed playing the Glaive more once I learned how to do it properly, but the Glaive was far more energy intensive, and you're going to run through a whole lot of energy restore pads if you're playing with the Glaive. And while I think the Castana build is a little simpler, it does require you to pick up some extra damage, whether that be from a Riven or the Dashwire Augment. But if you're looking for something a little more interesting to play than a Warframe like Chroma or Rhino, Ivara is a good option, and the Navigator build is very unique. There aren't too many builds like this in Warframe, and when one comes along, it's always a lot of fun to play around with it. But that's going to do it for this video going over the Ivara Navigator build. And I just want to give a big thanks to Ironhead from the Discord, who helped me put together and understand the Navigator build. This video wouldn't have been possible without him. And if you found the video helpful, I'd appreciate it if you leave a like. But that's going to do it for me, guys. Hope you all have a good one, and I'll see you later.